Well, hello to you all. We aren't able to meet today because of the weather. Hopefully, you all are staying warm by the fire. Today's lecture will be on Chapter 2, The Chemistry of Life. So, we may ask ourselves the question, why are we studying chemistry, or why are we even interested in chemistry in a biology class? So, in previous lecture, we did speak a little bit about hierarchy and organization and that life is organized. And we certainly placed emphasis on cells coming together to make tissues, which come together to make organs, which come together to make organ systems, etc. But I also put an example on the board showing a molecule of water being composed of two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen. So when we start talking about biochemical processes in our bodies and how we're just made up, there are chemical elements that are involved in biological processes as well. So we need to be at least familiarized with those. So let's start with an atom. An atom is the smallest chemical unit of any type of element. It is the building block of elements. It's the smallest piece of an element that retains its characteristics and it's the most pure form. So, what is an element? It is that fundamental item that cannot be easily broken down into smaller pieces. It's made up of only one thing, whatever that element is. So, gold is only made up of gold, silver is only made up of silver, copper is only made up of copper. So, it is that substance in its most pure form with nothing else added to it. That is an element. So I've mentioned the word atom, I've mentioned the word element, and oftentimes those two terms are used interchangeably, but they really aren't the same. Again, when we're thinking in terms of chemistry, think of what just a pure substance is, as I stated, gold, copper, etc. That is the element, the pure substance that cannot be broken down. But then when we look at, say, water, which the molecular formula is H2O, H2O, with the H standing for hydrogen and the O standing for oxygen, well, the H or hydrogen is an element. It's that pure substance, that pure chemical substance, just like oxygen within itself is a pure chemical substance. But then when we combine those in the proper ratios and you have your molecular formula H2O for water, we see that yes, we have the element of hydrogen, but we have two atoms of hydrogen within that water molecule and one atom of oxygen within that one molecule of water. So two different elements, hydrogen and oxygen, make up water, but they're in different proportions. And we that measurable standard in this particular case will be the atom. So you have two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of element making up one molecule of water. So you all may remember maybe from high school chemistry, this particular slide that includes the periodic table. And the periodic table just basically lists all these pure elements. They're organized in a particular fashion. We won't get into that because this is not a chemistry class, but I do want you to be familiar with the periodic table as well as the fact that, it lists all of the different elements. Now, if you'll notice on this particular slide, it's labeled where you see the word atomic numbers pointing to the number 8, the element being oxygen, the symbol for oxygen being O, and then there's an atomic weight that's listed. So there's some key information that we can get from just looking at the periodic table. So we know that biology is the study of life and study of living things. So what is chemistry? Well, chemistry is a science concerned with the composition, structure, and properties of matter that includes elements, etc., and the various chemical reactions that these elements may participate in. Biology studies all living organisms. Living organisms are made up of chemical elements, molecules, and compounds. Chemistry is the study of how these atoms and elements combined to and interact to form molecules and compounds. This slide really is just a reminder of how things are just so interconnected. We look at the fact that biology is the scientific study of life. Life is made up of cells. Cells are made up of molecules. Molecules are made up of atoms. And there are various biochemical and chemical processes that go on. within these cells and in life in general within organisms to create energy and various types of macromolecules like carbohydrates, protein, are synthesized and used in life. This slide, it's just kind of a flow chart to get you thinking in the right direction. As the semester goes on, we will tie all of these components together, but this is just more of a preview slide of what's to come. And again, just a reminder that life is organized and it's organized down to the most minute component, that is an atom. Okay, and these atoms will come together to form molecules. And then we've already talked about the fact that we have cells. Our cells are made up of molecules. Cells come together to make tissues, tissues, organs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, just keep in mind that everything is interconnected. There's a hierarchy. There's always this building process of these various structures coming together to make a whole component of something. So let's take a moment to define a few terms. So matter. Matter is anything that takes up space and that has mass. Mass is the amount of matter contained in an object. Mass does not change regardless of gravity, but weight does. So let me just kind of pause right there. You have mass, you have weight, and a lot of times we will use the terms interchangeably. Weight is dependent upon gravity. The gravity on Earth determines our weight, but our mass is just that physical solid structure of what we are. So you have a glass, it has mass, it has a physical capacity. If you weigh that glass, whatever the weight of that glass is, it really is dependent upon the gravitational pull that Earth has on that, as it does with anything. But if you go to another planet that has no gravity or has less gravity than Earth does, then the weight will be different, but the mass will not change because it will still be that same solid glass that it was all the time. Energy. Energy is defined as the ability to do work. We've already stated that an element is a substance that cannot be broken down. So gold is gold, silver is silver. Can't be broken down by any chemical means into any other substance. So in other words, it can be changed into something else. It is that pure substance. So an element of hydrogen cannot be broken down to anything else other than hydrogen, but a molecule of water can be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen because it is composed of those two different elements. An atom is the smallest chemical unit of an element. So again, why is chemistry important in biology? Well, when we look at chemistry, we look at the various elements, molecules, compounds. Say, for instance, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. All living organisms actually contain those particular elements. They all contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, or if they don't contain them, they certainly utilize them. In chemistry, chemistry depends on molecules of, say, DNA and RNA. Those are important to us in biology because that is the genetic material that is passed down from one generation to the next. DNA is. Chemistry also deals with pH, which we'll talk about that, hormones, gas exchange. Well, that all plays a role in homeostasis. And remember, we talked a little bit about homeostasis being that internal constancy, that balance, that equilibrium. When we talk about, internal body temperature, as well as being able to figure out if we're hungry or not, that there are certain processes within our bodies that drive forces forward to let us know that we are hungry or that we're cold or too hot. Chemistry involves acids, bases, vitamins, minerals. Well, those things are important in biology when it comes to digestion. Chemistry relies on plant hormones like ethylene. Well, in biology, that's important in terms of fruit ripening. So, again, there is a connection between chemistry and biology and some interdependency. So, as previously stated, our body contains many chemical elements. And the four elements that are most common to all living organisms are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And of those, if you will observe from looking at the outline of the the human body, as well as just reading the chart, you'll see that the element in highest percentage or most abundance in our body is oxygen. So oxygen is the element in highest abundance in our bodies. So when we talk about elements within our bodies that are relative to biochemical processes that occur, we categorize them as either bulk elements or trace elements. Now, bulk elements are required in the largest amounts by our bodies. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are the most abundant. Phosphorus and sulfur are also important along with sodium and magnesium, but again, in highest amounts are going to be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, with oxygen being the most abundant bulk element. Bulk elements are the building blocks of the compounds that make up our organs and muscles. Next, we have trace elements. Now, trace elements are only needed in small amounts. Some are very important nutritionally. A few include, say, copper, selenium, and magnesium. Now, I don't expect for you to memorize this slide, but this is just to kind of give you an idea of where various elements are in our body or what relevance or significant role they may play. Say, for instance, copper plays a role in red blood cell, uh, blood vessel nerve developments, etc. Iron making up hemoglobin, a protein in our red blood cells. Um, Cobalt, chromium, selenium, the selenium helps to make DNA and protect against some damage, cell damage and infections. Zinc is important in the immune system, etc. So again, just to kind of give you an idea so that you can have some sort of visual perspective that we're talking about these various elements, but just showing you that they're relevant to certain body functions, therefore you can find them located within certain organs and systems within the body. So we've talked about these atoms being these very small particles and units, if you will, that will make up a molecule. But these atoms also have components or different parts, and we call them subatomic particles. And these subatomic particles have an electrical charge, either a positive charge or a negative charge, but then there are some that have no charge at all. Now, these subatomic particles that I'm referring to, if you look at the chart, you have an electron. Electrons have a negative charge. You have protons that have a positive charge, but then you have neutrons that have no charge whatsoever. So I kind of think about neutrons as being neutral, therefore they have no charge. So let's look back at the periodic table. We had looked at it at a previous slides, and I pointed out that there were some labels there. And if you'll notice circled in red, the word atomic number for the number 8. So an element's atomic number actually is the number of protons that each atom of that element contains. An element's atomic mass is the number of protons and the number of neutrons that are located in the nucleus. So whenever you see atomic number actually is telling you the number of protons, those positively charged subatomic particles that are located within the atom. There are a couple of different variations in terms of atoms and atomic particles, one being an ion and the other one being an isotope. So let's look at what an ion is. An ion is simply a charged atom. So remember we had talked earlier when we were looking at the periodic table and we looked at that atomic number of 8, say for instance on oxygen, which let us know that there were 8 protons. That was the atomic number of the element. Now here, when we start talking about ions and now that the atom becomes charged, because an ion is an atom that either gains or loses an electron. In the example that's shown here, we'll look at the element hydrogen. So in the normal circumstances, hydrogen would have 1 proton, so that means the atomic number is 1. Doesn't have any neutrons, and it also has 1 electron. Remember, the proton has a positive charge, the electron has a negative charge, so the overall net charge of hydrogen normally would be 0. But if based upon chemical processes that go on, that hydrogen happens to lose an electron. Now it'll continue to have its one proton as it always did. The atomic number will not change and it still won't have any neutrons. But now, if for whatever reason it loses hydrogen, loses an electron, now the net charge becomes one. It's a positive charge now because you no longer have the electron with a charge of -1 balancing out or canceling out the charge. So +1, -1 under normal circumstances, as opposed to now that it is an ion, it has a positive charge because it has lost an electron. So there's no more canceling out, if you will, of charges. Now you have an overall charge of 1. So that element now becomes positively charged and is signified by a superscripted indicator with that H plus. So again, not to get too deep into chemistry, but again, if you have an atom and it loses electrons, now the atom is driven to be more positive. And in this particular case, the atom that we're looking at, or the element that we're looking at, is sodium. It's lost electrons. Now it has an overall positive charge. So many of us are familiar with the term electrolyte, especially now that, we're into health and fitness and we think about, oh, okay, we exercise, we sweat, we lose electrolytes and we need to regain electrolytes. And sometimes we'll drink beverages that contain electrolytes like Gatorade. So electrolytes are chemicals that conduct electricity when mixed with water. They regulate nerve and muscle function, they hydrate the body, balance blood acidity and pressure, and help rebuild damaged tissues. So we just stated that an ion is a charged atom. But I told you that there are a couple of variations of atom, the second one being isotopes. Isotopes are just different forms of the same element. We saw in ions, there is generally a gain or loss of electrons. But when we're talking about isotopes, we're talking about the number of neutrons. So generally there's a variation in the number of neutrons when we're talking about isotopes. So isotopes are different forms of the same element, and the number of neutrons varies within this particular element, thereby changing the mass of the element. Now there are 3 naturally occurring isotopes of carbon: carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. Both carbon-12 and carbon-13 are stable, whereas carbon-14 is produced by thermal neutrons from cosmic radiation. So in other words, radiation from the sun. So carbon-14 is produced in the atmosphere and it can combine with oxygen and carbon dioxide. It can be incorporated into plants by photosynthesis and then eaten by heterotrophs. Remember those consumers? The organism dies and no new carbon-14 is added, and that forms the basis or principle of radiocarbon dating, or just plain old carbon dating. We refer to it as. Some of you all may have heard of that. So that's just the basic overview of carbon dating. We've been able to take advantage of things like isotopes and radioisotopes in terms of medicine and using it in, say, what's called a PET scan, positron emission tomography, or a CAT scan. So again, this is nothing I really want you to memorize, but just again, a familiarization that chemistry again is very relevant in terms of biology, in terms of medicine, as we see here. We're using it for procedures as well. So they do have a role that is played that's very relevant to biology. So questions I want you to think about and actually look up the answer to as you're doing your reading. Where in an atom are protons, neutrons, and electrons located? What determines the atomic number? Well, we've already seen that if you look at the periodic table, the number of protons actually determines the atomic number, is the same as the atomic number. But then the question is, what is atomic mass? Well, remember there were three subatomic particles. There were protons, neutrons, and electrons. Well, the number of protons plus the number of neutrons equals the atomic mass. So, we can just do a little simple arithmetic on that. The atomic number of potassium is 19, and the mass is 39. So how many protons, neutrons, and electrons are in an atom of potassium? Well, normally the number of protons and electrons are the same because we want it to be a neutral charge, except for in the case of, say, an ion, when now you have an overall charge or net charge of either plus or minus due to the loss or gain of electrons. But as I just previously stated, the atomic mass equals the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So if I know that the mass is 39 and I know that the atomic number is 19, well, I can do some simple arithmetic to determine what the number of neutrons are. But I also know that under normal circumstances, and in this particular case, we expect for the circumstances to be normal, the number of electrons should be the same or equal the same number as the number of protons. So if the atomic number is 19, that means that the number of protons is 19, and we will assume no charge, so the number of electrons are also 19. But to determine the number of neutrons, now we would subtract the number of protons from that atomic mass, which is 39, to gain that answer. So we talked a little bit about water as a molecule, and that molecule of water is made up of two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen. But how does that come about? Well, these atoms will actually bind together. There are chemical bonds that actually hold these or join these atoms together in order to form a molecule. So just define a term, compound. A compound is any molecule made up or substance made up of two or more elements. So a compound is made up of two or more elements. And these bonds that actually hold these atoms together in order to produce a molecule of something or a compound is actually determined by the electrons. Now, the electrons around an atom determine how the atom will react with other atoms. And again, not to get deep into chemistry, but just to kind of give you a little sneak peek for those of you all who may, have a chemistry background as well. So what happens is these bonds will fill vacancies that exist within the orbit that the electrons exist in around the atom. So if there's a vacant space, the electron will see there's a vacant space and then it will kind of come in and move in. But it's not a haphazard process. It's very specific in how these processes occur or this bonding occurs. Bonding can actually occur by two different atoms sharing electron or sharing that electron space. That's called covalent bonds. So covalent bonds are formed when atoms share electrons. And there are different types of covalent bonds. It can be a nonpolar covalent bond, or you can have what's called a polar covalent bond as well. So polar covalent bonds, actually, atoms with different electronegativity will combine to form what's called a polar covalent bond. So you have a positive and negative pole, as is seen with water, okay, a positive charge and a negative charge, and this is based on the different elements that are contained within that molecule or that compound. Polar covalent bonds are weak bonds, um, hydrogen bonds. So this polarity, in other words, having two different charges within the same molecule. So in this particular case, once again, we're talking about water. So since electrons spend more time near oxygen, the oxygen atom has a slightly negative charge because remember, electrons are negatively charged, whereas protons are positively charged. And since the electrons spend less time near hydrogen, the hydrogen atom has more of a positive charge or a slight positive charge. So again, just that term itself, polar, indicates that there are different charges, positive and negative charges that exist within this particular molecule or compound. And just to give a different view of hydrogen bonds that exist within a water molecule, the slight positive charge of hydrogen atom of one water molecule attracts a slight negative charge on the oxygen of the neighboring water molecule, and they'll come together to form a hydrogen bond to hold those molecules together. Now, these hydrogen bonds that we see in water are considered to be weak bonds, but biochemically they are very important because, again, these weak hydrogen bonds are seen in so many different macromolecules within our bodies and other elements. So, these hydrogen bonds can be seen in water, they are seen in DNA, which is our genetic material, seen in proteins that are also very, very important within our bodies for so many different processes within our body. The hydrogen bonds pull the water molecules close to each other. And we just talked about those covalent bonds, and those covalent bonds are formed by sharing of electrons. The next type of bond I want to talk about are ionic bonds. Ionic bonds, very electronegative atoms, can take electrons from other atoms. So, in the process of ionic bonding or ionic bonds being formed, there is a transfer of electrons, and it can go either way. An element can lose an electron or they can gain an electron. But again, there's a transfer of one or more electrons of an electron from one atom to a next. So, ionic bonds are formed by the transferring of electrons. They're very strong bonds, unlike hydrogen bonds, which are weak, which means they can be easily broken. Ionic bonds are very strong bonds. In this particular slide, we're showing the atom or an atom or the element chlorine. This atom is so much better at attracting electrons that it completely pulls an electron away from sodium and therefore will come up with sodium chloride, which is the same thing as salt. So in this ionic bonding, the transfer of an electron forms a charged atom. And remember, we stated previously that a charged atom is just an ion. So an ion is a charged atom. So ionic bonds will form ions. So the chlorine ion has one extra electron. The sodium ion has one less electron. These opposite charges will attract each other. A very strong bond is formed in this transfer of electrons. And here we have sodium chloride, so the Na and the Cl, which is just basic table salt. So we'll stop here for today, and on Thursday, we will talk a little bit more about chemistry and the chemistry of life and how chemistry and biology are interrelated. This is all coming from chapter 2 in your textbook, so please read chapter 2 in your textbook to gain a better understanding of the chemistry of life. Stay warm and stay safe.